Hi everybody and welcome to our webinar today. We're going to be looking at the changes to the 2023 to 2024 apprenticeship funding rules, and the webinar is aimed at training providers. I'm Nick Duff from the Service Engagement team, and that's within the Apprenticeship Service, and I'll be looking after you and hosting today's session. A quick reminder about the registration process. So by registering and attending today, you're giving your consent and agreeing for the webinar to be recorded and uploaded onto our YouTube channel. So if you feel that you've changed your mind about that consent, can I ask you please to dial off. Also today I'm joined by other colleagues from our funding policy team, and they'll be taking you through the main input. So they'll be talking to you about the main funding rule changes. So you'll hear from Laura Orritt-Hopkins, from Karen Clark, and from Kate McDonough. And they'll also be joined by a couple of other colleagues as well, Ambrish Patel, Faisal Ahmed, and Aisha Suleiman, and they're going to pitch in on the Q&A panel where they need to. So welcome to all of you guys. So today's session is going to last about 60 minutes or so, and as I said, we'll have that Q&A session towards the end to pick up any of the questions that our delegates have got. So Laura and Karen are going to run through the key changes. Laura, Karen and Kate will run through the key changes, and then we'll round up the session with details of additional support. As usual, we won't go into questions that don't relate to today's topic, or if you've got a question that's too specific about a particular circumstance, we'd always recommend for these types of queries that you go through our support desk, and I'll share the support desk contact details a little bit later on as well. Hopefully there'll be quite a few questions asked today, and we'll try and get through, like I said, as many of them as possible. But what I will do is try and theme some of the questions. So where we've got the same sort of questions being asked multiple times, I'll just try and theme the question, ask it once, so that we don't get the panel members answering the same sort of questions over and over again. If we don't manage to cover everything, all the questions that we've got, what we'll do is we'll take them away, and then we'll come back to everybody that registered, that dialed in today, and we'll get some responses to the main themes that were raised back out to you by email after the session. Okay, so I'm handing over first to Laura, who's going to take us through the first part of the input. Laura, are you there?
Yep, thank you, Nick. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, got you loud and clear.
Great. Okay, so hi everybody. So as Nick said, my name is Laura Orritt-Hopkins, and I'm one of the senior managers on the apprenticeship funding policy team at DFE. So I have responsibility for the overall production and publication of the apprenticeships funding rules, as well as some of the actual policy areas themselves. So we're going to use this session to talk through some of the key changes to the 23-24 rules. We published the initial version of the rules on the 31st of March, and that was in order to highlight the proposed changes. And it gave the sector and stakeholders the opportunity to provide us with feedback on any areas that seemed unclear or ambiguous or sort of problematic. The feedback mailbox closed on the 28th of April, which meant there was a 4-week period for stakeholders to provide us with their feedback. And first of all, I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank anyone on the call who did take us time to send us feedback. This has all now been reviewed, and where appropriate, changes have been made for version 1 of the rules, which we published on the 12th of May. So as always, the main changes for 23-24 are outlined in the summary of changes document, which we always produced alongside a new set of funding rules. In terms of the format of this year's webinars, we're going to follow what we did last year. So instead of going through the summary of changes in detail as we did in previous years, we're going to follow last year's format, and we're going to focus on the key issues and changes to provide more context around the rationale for the changes and any further changes that we made as a result of your feedback. So this does mean, though, that this webinar will not cover every single change, and therefore we would strongly recommend that if you haven't already done so, you refer both to the summary of changes and the full funding rules documents. Moving on to the next slide, before we get into the detail of the rules changes, I wanted to just say something about the overall context to the rules for 23-24, which has been one of simplification. So simplification is not just specific to the funding rules, but it's an overall commitment to make it easier for employers and providers to support high quality apprenticeships. And the funding rules form one of a number of work strands for simplification. In our review of the funding rules for 23-24, we spoke with a range of stakeholders to get their views on barriers or issues with the rules. And these stakeholders included AOC, AELP, UVAC, employer providers. And as part of this feedback, we also asked for potential resolutions to the issues. In parallel with us getting this stakeholder feedback, our team undertook a line-by-line review of each section of the rules, removing, simplifying and restructuring wherever possible, whilst retaining rules that are key. So this work therefore resulted in a significant number of changes to our approach to the rules for 23-24. If I could have the next slide, please. So as well as the actual rules changes that we'll talk about shortly, there are also a number of presentational changes that we've made this year. And these are all intended to simplify the rules and make things easier for providers and employers. So one of the key pieces of feedback that we received was around earlier publication of the rules in order to give stakeholders, training providers, employers more time to plan and implement any changes required in their systems and processes. We therefore published the initial version of the rules on the 31st of March, 4 months before the start of the funding year, and that was two months earlier than last year. And this was then followed by version 1, which we published, as I said before, on the 12th of May. You may recall that in previous years, we had 3 separate rules documents. So one for providers, one for employers, and one for employer providers. But stakeholders told us that having 3 documents added complexity and created duplication in content. So we've therefore brought the 3 documents into one single document, whilst trying to ensure that the responsibilities of each party remain clear. If I could have next slide. So in combining the 3 previous documents, we undertook a line-by-line review of the rules. We removed unnecessary content, we restructured a number of the sections. Now, this review has contributed to a reduction in the word count of almost 30% compared to the previous main provider rules document. I think it's just worth noting that to make the rules more accessible for readers, there is more white space within the document. So while the number of pages may not have actually reduced, the word count has, and that's been quite significant. Finally, we have reviewed all of the evidence requirements and included the relevant evidence requirements at the end of each section, rather than having a huge list at the end as we did before. So I'll now hand over to my colleague, Karen, who will start to go through the policy changes.
Thanks, Laura. I'm hoping everyone can hear me okay. So as Laura said, my name's Karen. I'm Karen Clark. I'm one of the senior managers on the team, and I'm going to go through some of the areas of the funding rules that I've got responsibility for. So starting off with initial assessment. So Laura's just mentioned that we did a line-by-line review of the funding rules this year as part of the simplification project. And because of that, we decided that some areas of the funding rules would benefit from being moved around and grouped together in a slightly better way. And this is really one example of that. So in this part of the funding rules, we moved all of the information that was needed for the initial assessment exercise and grouped it all together towards the front of the document. So in the initial assessment section, you'll now see all of the information and rules for learner eligibility, programme eligibility, learning support, and English and maths all together in that one section. And then towards the end of that section, there's the funding rules that relate to what needs to happen after the assessment exercise is complete. So in other words, the outcome of the initial assessment. And when we were working on the initial version of the 23-24 rules, we got feedback, like Laura said, from stakeholder bodies. And part of that feedback was about it was often difficult to get employers looped into these conversations on initial assessment and the outcome of the exercise, especially on a face-to-face basis. The question, I suppose, really being, what could we do to mitigate or simplify that in the funding rules? So we didn't want to drop the requirement for the employer being involved, because it's really important that everyone's got a shared understanding of the process and what the results are saying about the apprentice. But we did take on board the concerns raised, and we made some changes to this section. So first, there was a little bit of a language change. I think previously we've talked about the conversation being a meeting in various places, and we've implied that the discussion is a face-to-face one. And so for 23-24, we changed all the references to discussion, and we clarified that those discussions could be virtual or via email. So that was the first change. The second change we made was to say that if the employer was still unable to attend the discussion, even though it's virtual or via email, the provider had to do two things. So first, the provider had to give the employer the opportunity to contribute to the outcome meeting, so give them the relevant information to help them contribute. And then they had to send them information afterwards for their review and signature about what had been decided. And the purpose of that was really to allow a degree of flexibility, but still keeping the employer in the loop. So that was the changes we made on the outcome of the initial assessment section. We made a few other changes in that section. So for example, we moved the requirement to discuss roles and responsibilities here. That wasn't new text, that requirement. The roles and responsibilities requirement has always been in the training plan bit of the funding rules. But we thought we should move forward, because some of the feedback we'd had during the last funding year when we've been speaking to employers is they've indicated they don't always know or understand the extent of what they're required to do with their apprentice, especially the time commitment in relation to taking part or providing input into progress reviews. And they don't often know that or understand that until the apprentice has already started on the programme. So that's the reason we brought that forward into the initial assessment, because that conversation really needs to happen at the very beginning. We also outlined the requirement for the employer to formally commit to those progress reviews. So as a provider, you had the confidence that the employer knew what they were signing up to. We got a little bit of feedback on this section in the feedback window. We didn't get lots. I think the feedback we mainly got centred on language. I think in some places, I think it was the summary of changes, we still had a reference to it being a meeting rather than a discussion. So we tightened that up for version 1. And just to be clear, if your current process is that you do have face-to-face meetings with employers about the initial assessment, you don't need to change that if that's working well for you. We're not suggesting that needs to now change into some sort of email exchange. And we did have that question a few times as part of the feedback. The other feedback we had from employers said that, as well as not really understanding the time commitment for progress reviews, they didn't often understand their commitment in relation to the financial contribution to the apprenticeship until after the programme had started. And again, we think that conversation really needs to happen right up front before the programme begins. So we moved that into the initial assessment section for version 1. Next slide, please. So just moving on to programme eligibility. For the majority of this section for programme eligibility, there weren't a lot of changes. The main changes in this section were in off-the-job training and in progress reviews, and I'll come on to those in a moment. But before I do those sections, I just want to cover off these areas first. So starting off with apprenticeship agreement. In this section, we outlined the provider's role in checking the information on the agreement, that it was complete, and that included a check that the agreement had been signed by 2 different people. So there was 2 different signatures on the agreement. We got very little feedback about the section. There were a couple of comments around the fact that the information fields on the agreement might be complete, but they might not necessarily be correct. And there were a couple of comments around, asking who was responsible for amending the agreement, so leading on that change if the apprenticeship duration changed. And we clarified those 2 areas for version 1. Moving on to apprentice wages. In relation to this section in 23-24, we were clear that if an employer doesn't pay the apprentice a lawful wage, the individual is ineligible to receive apprenticeship funding. So the feedback we got for this section really centred on the remit of the provider in this space, and many people felt that checking whether the employer was paying a lawful wage shouldn't really sit with the provider, which totally understand. Longer term, we're trying to establish some data sharing arrangements with HMRC that might mitigate some of these checks and almost make these part of the rules redundant, but we're just not there yet. So right now we still need providers to have a bit of an oversight role here and make sure that the employer understands their obligations in relation to wages. But for version 1, we did make it clear that the provider is only responsible for checking that the employer is paying a lawful wage whilst the apprentice is on the programme. So before and after isn't obviously down to the provider. And also we clarified that the evidence to underpin that could simply be a statement from the employer on the signed training plan. So if the employer says they're paying a lawful wage and that's what they've told you, and they've signed a training plan and that's got a statement on to say that that's what they're doing, we wouldn't hold the provider liable if they weren't doing that. I think that was probably the biggest concern we had on this section. Minimum duration. So moving on to the final bit of this slide. One of the areas we used to get a lot of queries on, and I've just noticed a query that's already come in on this, is where a part-time learners programme has been extended as per the funding rules, but the apprentice is, for whatever reason, in a position to be able to complete it earlier in advance of the extended planned learning end date. I suppose the query being is, does the apprentice have to stay for that full extended duration, or can they finish their programme earlier? And we've dealt with those queries just one-on-one. As they've come in, we've responded to those queries. But in doing the drafting for 23-24, because we were getting quite a few of those queries of the same nature, we took the opportunity to make this part of the rules a little bit clearer. So we clarified that any apprentice, including those who were part-time, can complete their programme earlier than their planned learning end date, the one that's on the ILR, provided the minimum duration and the minimum off-the-job hours threshold for their actual time and training have been met. So that's what we had in the initial version of the rules. The feedback we got suggested there was still a little bit of confusion here around, first of all, why we require the extension in the first place. People still don't really understand that. And B, whether the minimum duration we'd made reference to in the initial version of the rules was the statutory 12 months or this new extended duration that had been calculated. So just talking through kind of, I want to talk through why we require the extension in the first place. So the reason we say that programmes for part-time workers have to be extended is because as a cohort, so as a group, this group represents a higher funding risk to us in relation to the delivery of the job training and in relation to withdrawals, more so than part-time learners. Part-time apprentices are less likely to do the average of 6 hours a week, for example, and they're more likely to take longer to complete their programme, and that has a higher risk of withdrawal. So we need to pay for them in a slightly different way. We can't pay part-time apprentices in the same way as full-time apprentices because we're not really getting the same return for that funding, and that's why we kind of ask you to extend the programme to manage that risk and to pay them in a slightly different way. But where the programme has been delivered earlier than planned, because perhaps the part-time learner has been able to spend an average of 6 hours a week on off-the-job training, for example, then provided the minimum duration of 12 months and the minimum requirements for off-the-job training have been met, they can finish their programme earlier than the extended duration. So hopefully we've made that clearer in version 1. I know there's a question that's already come in, so I will kind of pick that up again as part of the questions. But just to clarify, the minimum duration we're talking about in this section is still the 12 months. Next slide, please. So moving on to off-the-job training. So we made one key policy change here in this section, and that was to change the frequency around active learning from every 4 weeks to every calendar month. The other updates we initially made to this section included saying that revision, exams and other testing couldn't be included as off-the-job training because in some cases what we were seeing was a very disproportionate amount of off-the-job training being categorised as revision. We also clarified that it was only statutory leave that could be deducted as part of off-the-job training, as part of the calculation, even if the apprentice's own annual leave entitlement was higher. That was due to some calculation errors that were kind of picked up during funding audits. We said that planned off-the-job training had to be agreed in advance of delivery, and that again was due to funding audits where we were finding there wasn't really any clear link between the evidence that auditors were being presented with and the training plan. There was just no match between the two. And finally, we said that it was the provider who was ultimately responsible for all off-the-job training delivery, even if it was delivered by another party, again, as a result of funding audits and some of the issues we were finding there. So they were the initial changes, those 5 bullet points. And the feedback we got from the draft set of funding rules really mainly centred around 3 key areas. The first of those was revision. I think most people who fed back accepted the rationale for not including exams and other testing because it's a replay of knowledge rather than, you know, a learning activity essentially. But people really strongly disagreed with our approach in relation to revision. So we looked at all the comments and the various arguments that people made, and we took those away, and on balance we decided that we should include revision in the list of acceptable off-the-job activities. Now, I think this is an area that we will probably need just to continue to look at, but just really in terms of just making sure there's no disproportionate volumes of revision compared to, you know, the rest of the activities that can be included as off-the-job training. But we do accept that revision can help embed and reinforce new learning, so it can be included specifically where it supports the achievement of the apprenticeship. The second area of feedback, so the second to last bullet point on that slide, was really about language associated with the active learning change. A few people queried this language change. So previously, when the active learning rule was based on 4 weeks, the rule said that some active learning must take place every 4 weeks. So that was how it was phrased. And in moving the frequency to the calendar month, we softened the language slightly to say that there had to be a plan for active learning to take place in every calendar month. And people sort of queried kind of, you know, what was going on there with that language change. Now, clearly we want that plan to materialise into activity every calendar month, but we also want to avoid lots of breaks in learning where something happens which is outside of the control of the provider that disrupts the plan. So for 23-24, we've said that if planned off-the-job training is unable to take place as scheduled in any calendar month, a retrospective break in learning is not required, so long as there's active learning in the following calendar month. So I just want to give you an example of what I mean by that. So let's say, for example, there's planned activity to happen in January, February and March, but for some reason the planned activity in February doesn't happen, maybe because the apprentice calls in sick that day, and that was the only learning activity that had been planned for that month and couldn't be replanned for February. So as now, you would document the absence, and there should be evidence that the missed activity from February has been replanned. So that's what we'd be looking for, that you've actually replanned what the apprentice has missed. But you're now left obviously with a month where nothing has happened. So there's clear month, February, where there's no active learning taking place. If the activity in March went ahead as planned, there's no need for a break in learning to cover February. But if the planned activity in March was also cancelled, then a break in learning would be required. So that is quite a big flexibility compared to what we had in the previous funding year. And obviously, of course, if there'd been no plan for activity in any of those 3 months, so if there hadn't been a plan for February to begin with, for example, then that would also have required a break in learning. The last area of feedback I want to cover on this section was whether the frequency change from 4 weeks to calendar months would be retrospectively applied to existing learners, so those on programme. Now, I think generally with funding rules, it's really important that we don't keep moving the goalpost for activity that is already happening and that has already been planned and also might already have been audited. But what we have done is a bit of a compromise, is say that the existing 22-23 rules in relation to activity every 4 weeks apply up until the 31st of July, and then from the 1st of August for new starts and for existing learners, the new rules in relation for calendar months can apply. So that doesn't mean all training plans have to be changed, which again was another question we got in the feedback window. So if your existing training plan is compliant with the older 4 weeks policy, then clearly it's going to be compliant with the new calendar months policy too. So this is just about providing a little bit more flexibility, but only if you need it. So hopefully that explains that one. Next slide, please. So my final slides on training plans and progress reviews. So on the training plan section, we initially said that the training plan has to be agreed before any training is delivered, with a fully signed version of the plan being in place by the end of the 42-day qualifying day period. And the reason we added that was, again, when we were getting the stakeholder feedback when we were doing the initial version of the plan, we'd been told that it was really difficult to get all of the onboarding paperwork signed and in place before the programme actually starts, or before the learning start date. We also said in the initial version that the training plan has to detail the total volume of hours to be delivered for the full apprenticeship, with additional content or narrative being added as this becomes available. We previously said that plans could be iterative, and that for longer programmes we accepted that the full detail of the training plan might not be known at the start. But what was happening was that there was some training plans, so for example for a 3-year programme, that only had the volume of hours on for the first year rather than just the narrative for the first year. So we still need the full volume of hours for the full programme, because without that we don't know if there's going to be enough hours to meet the off-the-job threshold for the duration that you've submitted on the ILR. So if you've got a longer programme, if you've got a 3-year programme, we still need the full number of hours for the 3 years, but we accept that you might not have the content or the detail of what's going to happen in the 3 years necessarily. So there was that little bit of mismatch. Just in terms of the feedback we got on training plans, I think it's fair to say that the 42 days addition confused the majority of people. So just let me clarify this bit. So if your current process enables you to get a training plan agreed by the employer and the apprentice and all of the documentation signed and in place before the learning start date, then great, you should just continue to do that. We're not suggesting that anything needs to change here and you have to wait 42 days or anything like that. And we did get a few comments around, do we have to change everything? But we're not suggesting that at all. The addition of the 42 days was really a bit of a continuation from what I said earlier about initial assessment, about us recognising that sometimes discussions with employers are virtual or they're via email, they're not necessarily face-to-face. So in those cases, you might have agreed a training plan virtually on Teams, for example, or via email, and you've got email, evidence of that agreement, but you're not physically out there with the employer. You're not in a position to get the plan signed there and then. So now you've got a little bit longer to get the actual documentation signed by the employer, and that's all the 42 days is about. It's just about adding a bit of flexibility. If you don't need it, that's fine. Just continue as before. If you do need it, you've got that extra time now. And lastly for me, just on progress reviews. So previously we'd said in the 22-23 rules that these have to happen every 12 weeks. And in drafting the initial 23-24 rules, again, stakeholder feedback was telling us that some programmes would benefit from an alternative frequency, often due to module length. So we amended the policy to say that the reviews have to happen at least 4 times a year, carried out at 12-week interviews, unless there was an evidence delivery reason, such as module length, to adopt an alternative frequency. So if, for example, you've got 3 clear modules in a year, it might be more appropriate to have 3 reviews at the end of every module, for example. But progress reviews are a really important part of the programme, and I want to stress that. So to manage this, we said that if you were adopting an alternative frequency, that had to be agreed with the employer. So that was just to sort of mitigate against there only being, for example, 1 progress review in a year, where the employer is obviously expecting something different and more frequent. And we also said, a bit like the initial assessment outcome conversation, if the employer wasn't able to attend a progress review, they had to be given the opportunity to contribute, and they had to be sent the relevant information after the meeting for their review and signature. So there were a few comments on the frequency change in the feedback window, but on the whole, the majority of feedback was whether the change would or could be applied retrospectively. So like the change to active learning, we don't really want to move goalposts where things are already, in traction, in progress, already planned, and have already been audited, for example. But what we've now said in version 1, like the change to active learning, is that the frequency change can apply from the 1st of August to new starts and existing learners on programme. So up to the 31st of July, your existing programme needs to comply with the previous approach of having reviews every 12 weeks. And then if you need the added flexibility, and you might not, but if you do need that added flexibility, this can change from the 1st of August for any existing learner as well as new learners. But again, if you're comfortable with your existing approach and don't need the added flexibility, then you don't need to make any changes. So hopefully that's been helpful as a bit of a whiz through of some of the initial changes I made in my sections and some of the feedback I got and what I did as a result of that. So that's all from me for now. I think I'm handing over to Kate now. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Karen. So I'm just going to cover a couple of areas of the funding rules. So in last year's funding rules, we added a rule around secondments. So for the 2023-24 funding rules, we have updated the date for those organisations who are operating as an employment agency or business. And by this, we mean are adhering to the employment agency and business rules and guidance, which are published by the Department for Business and Trade. So where an apprentice who remains on their main employer's PAYE scheme will spend more than 50% of their apprenticeship duration on secondment or with another host employer, then these organisations can continue to take on apprenticeship starts up until the 31st of December 2023 and support them until their completion. For starts on or after the 1st of January 2024, only organisations on the register of Flexi-job apprenticeship agencies will be permitted to start new apprenticeships which are delivered via the model whereby the apprentices are placed with a host employer or seconded out for the majority of their apprenticeship. Now, there are only a couple of exceptions to this. So these are for apprentices who are part of the NHS Workforce Sharing Agreement or secondment arrangement, or for apprentices who are seconded to an organisation because that organisation is part of a pooled PAYE scheme, so therefore they are unable to access the apprenticeship funding themselves. So to ensure that any organisations who deliver this model had the opportunity to join the Flexi-job Apprenticeship Agency register, we reopened the register for new applications in May. And we did undertake a wide comms campaign to ensure that all potential interested parties were contacted. So this included an email to all employers who had an Apprenticeship Service account, as well as we worked with intermediary bodies to contact employment agencies and businesses. So for those organisations who applied during that window, successful applicants will join the Flexi-job Agency register at the beginning of October. And if you are a provider who is delivering training to apprentices who are employed by one of these agencies, could I please ask you to refer to the Provider Support Manual, which provides details on how these apprentices must be recorded in the ILR. And we are using this data to monitor the performance of these agencies, so it's really vital that the data is captured correctly. Next slide, please. So we've merged the sections which covered the additional payments for employers, providers and apprentices, so for care leaver bursary, into one section. So we're aware of the financial implications that care leavers can incur when moving into employment. So therefore, for any eligible apprentice that starts on or after the 1st of August 2023, they will receive a care leaver bursary of £3,000. And this will be paid over 3 equal instalments, as shown on the slide. And this is still paid to the provider, who must pass the payments on to the apprentice within 30 working days. So that hasn't changed at all. The care leaver bursary is a one-off claim, and an eligible apprentice must only receive the bursary once. So following feedback that we received, we've removed the requirement from providers to ensure that the apprentice hasn't received this bursary previously. And I just wanted to cover a couple more points regarding the care leaver bursary. So where an apprentice who is eligible to receive a bursary payment of £3,000 leaves their apprenticeship before receiving that full bursary amount, they will still be entitled to further payments on a new apprenticeship until they have received the £3,000 in total. And we've also been asked whether the bursary will have an impact on the apprentice's taxes or universal credit eligibility. So we've worked with HMRC to ensure that apprentices receiving the bursary will not lose income elsewhere. So it won't impact their national insurance contributions or income tax, and it will be treated as capital for universal credit purposes, meaning it will not impact universal credit entitlements unless the apprentice's total savings exceed £6,000. So I'm now going to hand you back to Laura to cover the remaining slides. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Kate. So I'm going to now highlight some of the updates we made to the endpoint assessments section. So the first thing to say is that this section is under review. And that's because we need to reflect the changes announced in May about the new Apprenticeship Providers and Assessment Register, known as the APAR, and the fact that from the 1st of August, apprenticeship providers will be responsible for choosing the endpoint assessment organisation for an employer, unless the employer wishes to continue to select the EPAO themselves. So these updates will be made in a version 2 of the rules, with the timescale for this to be confirmed. We've also made a couple of clarifications to the rules. These were included within the initial version and version 1. And really these were made as a result of a number of queries we received. So the first clarification is about apprentices who have completed all of their training, reached Gateway, and subsequently changed employer prior to taking their endpoint assessment. And some of the queries we've received highlight that the new job role doesn't relate to their apprenticeship. So in principle, we're very clear that the right thing for the apprentice is that they should be able to undertake their endpoint assessment and achieve their apprenticeship if they so wish. However, we do appreciate that this clarification has raised numerous questions and queries about how this should be reported to us, and in particular, how the provider can claim a completion payment. So we are currently working through the technical detail of this, just to say that it's not straightforward, but we will make it available as soon as we can. And in the process of doing that, we'll also confirm whether this clarification applies retrospectively, i.e. to those apprentices who started before the 1st of August 2023, because it's probably, well, it will be those apprentices who the queries that we've received relate to, because obviously anybody who hasn't started yet won't be in the position where they've reached Gateway and subsequently changed employer. So finally, for this section, another clarification in response to queries was about changing endpoint assessment organisation once the endpoint assessment had actually started. We've clarified in the rules that this is possible, although obviously it depends on the specific endpoint assessment requirements and the length of the endpoint assessment and the rationale for the change. So the provider, the training provider, will need to ensure that any withdrawal from the original endpoint assessment organisation is done in accordance with the contractual agreement between them and the EPAO. And obviously from a funding perspective, we will still only pay up to the funding band maximum. So the employer would therefore need to be aware that they would be responsible for paying the difference if the new total price goes above the funding band. Onto the breaks in learning section. We've updated this section to reflect the policy change from active learning having to take place every 4 weeks to having to take place every calendar month, and Karen covered that change in detail on her previous slides. So from a break in learning perspective, we are saying that a break in learning must be used where there is no plan for active learning to take place during a calendar month. And as Karen mentioned before, where active learning was planned but didn't take place, for example, because the apprentice was off sick, there is no need to put them on a break in learning as long as active learning takes place in the following calendar month. We've also clarified in this section that a break in learning isn't required for those apprentices with a term time only contract during the month of August. So in this circumstance, it is accepted that there will be no learning planned or taking place during the month of August for term time only apprentices, but a break in learning is not required, and so the provider would still be paid as usual for that month. So finally, in terms of next steps, I already mentioned version 2 of the rules to reflect changes to endpoint assessment, and there may also be some further amends to Annex A. We'll also be updating our supporting materials. So, for example, the off-the-job training guide, the training plan, the change of circumstances guidance. On the change of circumstances guidance, this information used to be included in the funding rules, but we took it out as part of our review, as it wasn't really rules as such, it was more guidance. However, we do understand that the information there is helpful, so we'll look to update and publish it separately. We're also publishing a summary document for employers. So this would include the key funding rules that are applicable to them, so they can see at a glance what they need to do. Our work on simplification continues, and that includes look at reducing eligibility checks through data sharing with HMRC. The changes we have made for 23-24 have received positive feedback in terms of simplification, but we still welcome further suggestions as to how we can go further. So do feel free to pop that into the question box if you have any sort of immediate feedback on how we can go further, or do drop us a line. I think Nick will include some contact details towards the end. So that's it from me, and so I'll hand back over to Nick. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Laura, Karen and Kate. That was a really great run through of the changes to the funding rules, and covering quite a lot of the points. And listen, thank you everybody else that's on the call as well for the questions. I said at the beginning I thought there were going to be quite a few, and you've certainly come through with lots of questions. So we'll try and rattle through these and get through as many of them as we can. But again, just bear with us if we don't manage to get through everything, but we will come out to you afterwards with some written lines on the main themes for the questions that you raised. So first one, Karen, if I can ask you a question about the within funding rules. It sounds like people are being required to keep copies of the learner's employment contract for an apprentice. Is that the case?
So not the actual contracts, because we obviously appreciate there's a lot of sensitive information there. Sometimes people have like employment letters that they're happy to share. That's got kind of the fact that they're on a full-time permanent contract. We're essentially looking for evidence that the person is employed and they're being paid a lawful wage when we talk about employment contracts. So as long as you've got something that underpins that, you don't need the actual contract.
Cool, thank you. Kate, there's a question about levy transferring. The rules state they need evidence of the transferring party, but because it's done through the Apprenticeship Service site, or certainly the majority of them are done through the Apprenticeship Service, do they actually need a signed document on that one?
So no, so just a screenshot from the Apprenticeship Service account from the receiving employer to see who the sending employer is supporting that transfer is fine. You don't need anything signed from the sending employer or anything like that. There is a further question further down, Nick, which asks kind of why we're asking for that evidence. So I'll answer that now as well. Basically, the sending employer can't provide any of the training for the apprenticeship that they're funding. So, and that's either through the main provider route or as a subcontracting route, supporting provider route. So that's kind of why we're asking providers to keep hold of that. So if you do subcontract any provision, you're not sending it back to the employer that sent the transfer in the first place. So that's kind of why we ask for it.
Cool, thank you. And I apologise if I get to that question and ask it again, but we'll see.
That's all right.
So the next question on Karen, I've got a couple for you. There's a question about apprentices completing earlier than planned and what the impact is on their off-the-job training. So can it be less than planned, or should it meet the but should meet at the I'll read this again, sorry. Where an apprentice completes earlier than planned, the off-the-job training can be less than the planned, but should meet at the endpoint and should meet at completion date. Sorry, that was a really garbled way of asking that question. Do you understand what I've just asked, Karen?
I think I understand, yeah. So any apprentice can complete earlier than the planned learning end date that you've got on the ILR, whether they're part-time or full-time, provided the 12 months is the statutory 12 months has been met. Obviously, just because you're bringing that completion date earlier doesn't necessarily mean you're delivering less off the job. You might be delivering more than 20% or more than 6 weeks on average. So you might be still delivering the same volume of off the job over a shorter period. if you are delivering less off the job than you initially planned, as long as you've got enough off the job for the actual new duration, so if it's a shorter duration, it still has to meet that, and you would still have to do the employer statement to explain the difference between the original plan and what you've actually delivered. So that's the two things just to take away there, I think.
Okay, thank you. And then there's a question about minimum duration and part-time apprentices. And I think that there's an example they're quoting about an apprentice being effectively half-time, and what the impact is on their minimum duration. So does that mean that they do twice the length? So is there any comments about minimum duration for part-time apprentices?
Yeah, so this is what I was getting at earlier in terms of the feedback. So the question we're being asked is about somebody who's working a 15-hour week, and therefore a typical 12-month program gets extended to 2 years. Now, you might, because you're delivering more than planned off the job training per week, so you're delivering more than a typical average for a part-time learner, you might actually be able to deliver that full program in, say, 20 months or 18 months rather than the 2 years. So as long as you do the 12 months, as long as you've done enough off the job training for your actual duration, you can complete earlier. They don't have to sit there 24 months, basically, is what we're saying. So that's what we've tried to make clearer in the funding rules. But we still need you to still extend that duration initially, because we still do need to manage that risk, because not all part-time people can typically receive more or get more off the job training than a typical part-time person. So, there will be some edge cases where they're able to do the same as a full-time person, but not all part-time people can do that. So we still do need to manage that risk and extend the programme and the funding accordingly.
Excellent, thank you. Faisal, there's a couple of questions about visas. So I ask you for a bit of clarification on the wording regarding applicants who are on a visa when they apply, because the visa may expire during the duration of the apprenticeship.
Thanks, Nick. Yes, so the learner will have their visa will have to cover the duration of the apprenticeship for them to be eligible.
Okay, thank you very much. Laura, a couple of questions for you, if I can. Is there a change, or when will the change of circumstances document be available?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So we are looking at updating that. I also mentioned that we are looking into the technical detail of how to report to us the change on endpoint assessment, where somebody has reached gateway, changed employer, wants to take their endpoint assessment, and the provider needs to know how to claim the completion payment. So that the answer to that will go into the new change of circumstances guidance. So as soon as we resolve the technicalities on that, we can produce that guidance. Hopefully it will be, in a few weeks.
Okay, thank you. And whilst I've got you, there's a question about within version 1 there's no flowcharts anymore, so will they be in the final version?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because I've only had that question once previously. So we took the flowcharts out as part of our review, with the view that if the funding rules are clear, which we hope that they are, there shouldn't be a need for flowcharts, because it's just sort of a duplication of information. And so we took them out. If we get sort of inundated with feedback that people find them really, really helpful, then we would be willing, obviously, to look at that again. But I have to say we haven't had much feedback around the flowcharts at all.
Okay, cool, thank you. Karen,
Thank
a few
you.
questions to you then. Training plans issued immediately after initial assessment and are based on the initial assessment results. Can signing of that with evidence of the employer's can signing of this be evidence of the employer's signature for initial assessment purposes?
I think if it's clear the conversation has covered both things, I think that's fine. I think a lot of people do combine that discussion. These are the results, and this is how the results have impacted the plan. Sign here. I think that's fine. That would make sense to me. Yeah.
Okay, and then an apprenticeship agreement question. Is it expected that the apprenticeship agreement are updated if the apprenticeships go past their learning planned end date?
Yes, is a simple answer. So the apprenticeship agreement has to cover the full length the person is on the programme. Now, I think further down there are some questions around if people go past the planned learning end date, they're obviously not being funded, and that's what people have specifically said. So what's the point of the apprenticeship agreement in that case? But they are still on programme, and obviously there's the completion payment, which will come later on. So whilst there might be a gap in that you've drawn down all the monthly payments, there's still the completion payment to come. So we are technically still funding that person. They are still on a government programme. So the apprenticeship agreement has to cover that full government programme. So even if they go past the planned learning end date is the answer, yeah.
Okay, excellent. Then Laura, a question for you about minimum financial assistance declarations. Will we be providing a template for the declaration? And do employers need to break waive co-investment down by financial year? Can they just declare the total amount?
Yeah, so I think reading through the questions, there were quite a number asking around a template. We previously, when it was known as state aid, so this is in relation to what is now known as subsidy control, we previously didn't provide a template, largely because subsidy control policy is kind of owned by a different department, so it sits within the Department for Business and Trade. We are getting a lot of queries, I don't mind sharing that, you know, people are asking for a template. So I will try and pick that up, working with colleagues in the subsidy control unit at DBT to see what we can do around that. We just obviously need to be sure that we get it absolutely correct, as I say, because it isn't our policy as such. So we can look at that.
Thank you. Karen, 0-hour contracts. So can apprentices be employed on 0-hour contracts now, or does it still have to be 30 hours or part-time?
No, we've had 0 hours contracts in the funding rules for a number of years now. I mean, obviously, it makes planning an apprenticeship slightly more challenging, and there's obviously potentially a higher risk of dropout, because obviously a 0 hours contract is a bit more fluid, isn't it? And they're not necessarily permanent. Yeah, I mean, 0 hours contracts have been in the funding rules for a number of years now. Yeah, it's fine.
Thank you. And then whilst I've got you again, there's a number of questions about what can be included within off-the-job training, so things like revision, mocks, and various other things. So can you just confirm what could be included in off-the-job training?
So the activities that can be included are listed, they're bulleted in the funding rules, and obviously the change we've made this year is to say revision now can be included. But examinations, anything where you replay knowledge that you've got or that you're testing the apprentice on, so mock exams, final exams, that's where the apprentice is replaying their knowledge really. And yes, obviously as a result of the, depending on what the results of the mock test or the final test are, you might then have to go to do some more learning or some more revision. That bit's fine, but whilst you're replaying that knowledge, that's not new learning activity. So those things are still excluded, but revision for a mock exam, revision for qualification, for example, that's absolutely fine now.
Okay, thank you. Apprenticeship agreements, so it talks about being signed. Must it be signed on or before the start date of an apprentice?
So the date, in terms of the date that the agreement takes effect from, has to be on or before the person actually begins their learning. So that the apprenticeship agreement has an apprenticeship start date, which is the job bit, and it has a learning start date. So those two dates have to be correct. But the signature block, that technically can be afterwards. We wouldn't necessarily advise that. You should really kind of get that document signed, as part of the onboarding and as part of the initial assessment and doing the training plan and everything. But from a legal point of view, any contract, including an apprenticeship agreement, can be signed after the fact, as long as it's clear when the agreement takes effect from, and that's what you're signing to do. So for example, I could sign something today on the 14th of June that took effect on the 1st of June. Now I would sign it on the 14th of June. I wouldn't backdate the date, because if I backdated the date to the 1st of June, that's the fraudulent bit. But as long as the actual document was clear that I'm signing on the 14th of June and I understand this takes effect from the 1st of June, that bit's fine. But I think that makes things a little bit messy in my view. I would always try and get it signed before on the day, but if you can't get the employer pinned down, then you can sign it after the fact.
And there's a number of questions about signatures actually on various documents, and whether or not they e-signatures or I love this phrase, wet signatures are required.
No, we still do accept electronic and digital signatures, but I do know that even where some people do use kind of those kind of electronic systems, they're often taking a tablet or something out to the employer. So yeah, so even though it's a digital signature, they're sometimes still doing it as part of a face-to-face discussion. So the bit around it, accepting electronic and digital signatures hasn't changed. I think that question probably came in relation to the 42 days. So yeah, none of the stuff around signatures has changed. If you do electronic or digital signatures, that's still fine.
Okay, Laura, a couple of questions on endpoint assessment. So where an apprentice changes their employer, does it mean that all new employers will no longer be expected to pay for the completion fee, or will it only be cases where the new job role doesn't relate to an apprentice, doesn't relate to an apprenticeship?
So obviously, so I think we're talking about the paragraph on an apprentice changing employer, specifically where they had already reached gateway and now they want to undertake their endpoint assessment. And obviously there are a few different scenarios there, because the new job role may or may not relate to their apprenticeship, and the new employer may or may not want to support them. So I think we're going to have to cover off all of those different scenarios in our guidance on that scenario when we produce it. But what I would say is, if an apprentice changes employer, there is nothing we can do to make it mandatory for that new employer to support that apprentice's apprenticeship. So obviously, if a new employer doesn't want to support it and doesn't want to pay a completion payment, there is nothing we can do to force them. So I think we'll just need to understand those different scenarios and work through them in terms of the guidance.
Cool, thank you. When you were talking about actually the sort of the nuances around who's responsible for choosing the endpoint assessment organisation a little bit earlier, you talked about a revision to the funding rules and the next version. So there's a question about, I'll just ask for clarification on when version 2 is likely to be expected.
Yeah, so we've got no sort of specific time for scale for that at the moment, because we're just working through everything that might need to be included in that. But obviously we'll keep you updated, and we just need to work through that with some of our endpoint assessment colleagues.
Cool. Faisal, question about eligibility criteria in Annex A, particularly regarding the other non-UK nationals. Changes made in 277 weren't reflected in the changes document, but appears to have been updated. So particularly about 277.2, can you confirm if this is a new rule, or just a clarification?
Thanks, Nick. No, that was a clarification. It's not a new rule. We'll just be more specific.
Okay, thank you. Karen, going back to the employment contracts question, is it sufficient to have a signed document on the training plan that they are employed on in relation to being paid a minimum wage?
Yeah, that's fine. They can do that on the training plan. We're just looking for a declaration by the employer that they understand their obligations and they've signed up to it. So whether that's about the fact that they're employed, or they're being paid a lawful wage, or they're employed for the correct duration, all of those things can be on the training plan signed by the employer. That's fine as the evidence.
Okay. Faisal, can I go back to the visa question? So there's a follow-up. If the visa expires in the middle of the apprenticeship, they can renew it, can't they?
Well, in the rules state that before a learner starts an apprenticeship, they should have enough time to cover that whole apprenticeship. So the visa should cover the length, the entire duration of the apprenticeship. So it shouldn't be expiring in the middle.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you for that. So I'm just going to have a look through. I think I'm not going to go through any of those other questions. I think so. We're sort of running out of time, but there's a couple of slides I want to go through for you at the moment. So any of the questions that we've got quite a few that we haven't been able to get through. So the team will take them away and they will provide a written response on some of the themes that have been raised through those questions. So apologies that we haven't been able to get through those, but time is a little bit against us. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. Okay, whilst that catches up, there's a slide. There we go. Thank you. Just wanted to let you know really that we're hosting a series of technical webinars aimed at providers and employer providers, really useful for people in your organisations that actually do the maintenance of the ILR data. So please forward the registration details onto those individuals, because they'd really benefit from coming along to these sessions. We've got a session on TMPs and breaks in learning on August, a session on DLOCs on the 14th of September, something around understanding payment reports, particularly the submitting learner data reports on the 5th of October, and then a session on recording grades and certification later in November. They're not live yet, so you can't register at the moment. We're hoping to get them out in the next 3 to 4 weeks. So I'll give you the link to the webinar platform. Just advise some of your staff to have a look there, and we'll send out an invite anyway to you all, to all providers, so they're aware of when they're live. But yeah, just put those dates in people's diaries so that they can go along to those sessions. And we've also got a post-webinar survey question today to see what sort of content you'd like included in the DLOT webinar in September. So please do complete the survey when we leave. You go to the next slide. I've already talked to you about the fact that webinars are made available, the recordings of the webinars are made available. So this is our new home for our video content webinar recordings. We've still got the same 3 playlists on there, but we've moved from the ESFA page onto the DFE page. So I've got links in a handout to come where you'll be able to see and access the content that are on those links, and that includes also the webinar recordings as well. Move on to the next slide, please. Okay, just some information, mainly for employers, but we just wanted to let you know about it. So if you're talking to your employers, you can let them know. There's the top 100 apprenticeship employers. The winners of that are going to be announced in a live broadcast taking place on the 29th of June. It will be about 90 minutes and will include a full countdown of the 2023 rankings. So if you've got any of your employers that want to go along and listen to that, it's a great opportunity for them to hear the insights from other employers that have apprentices, so they can benchmark themselves against some of those that are receiving some awards. And also the National Apprenticeship Awards are celebrating their 20th anniversary this year. There's an application window for that, which is now open, and you've got until the 30th of June to apply, or employers have got until the 30th of June to apply, and all entries must be made via the appawards.co.uk website. There's slightly longer for the iFate award, but that still needs to be made through that same website. So visit that website for more information. And then on to our last slide, if I can. So there's lots of links on this last slide. There we go. Lots of links on this last slide. But what we've done is we've put a handout. So there's a PDF document on your control panel under the handout section. So if you can go and access that, you can download that, so you don't have to scribble them down whilst they're on screen. But I'm giving you links to apprenticeships.gov.uk because it's still a great place to go for information for employers and providers about apprenticeships in general and the Apprenticeship Service. I'll just remind you about the ESFA Communities platform, which is a peer-led discussion forum for providers. About registering for those technical webinars that I talked to, there's the link here. So all future webinars are going to be published on that link there. So make sure you pass that on to the colleagues to access the technical webinars. And then by the end of this week, we'll have a recording of today on that webinar platform as well for you to listen to for around 4, maybe 5, 6 weeks, until we can then put the more permanent recording up onto our YouTube channel, which is the link to that is on the previous couple of slides. And we've also got a link to the funding rules document and also the summary of changes document for you as well. And then finally, if you've got any specific queries about the Apprenticeship Service, you can either use the support tool or you can email them direct, and I'll put their contact details up on the slide. So contact them if you've got any particular queries about the Apprenticeship Service. Okay, so I think we're done. That brings us to the end of the session. Thank you all so much for joining us and giving us your time. Thank you very much to my speakers and to the Q&A panel as well for getting through as many of the questions as we did. And as you leave, please just remember to complete that short survey. So bye everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.